Ladies and gentlemen, scholars and friends, a very, very warm welcome to you at this yet another public lecture event of ISAS. It gives me enormous pleasure today to introduce to you our distinguished speaker, Mr. Ian Martin. I've had the honor and privilege of knowing Ian for some decades now as a very good friend of my country, Bangladesh, and also my family as well. Ian is a man of prodigious parts, both intellectual and moral, and someone who has dedicated himself to noble causes rather than lead a life of ease and comfort as his capabilities would surely be able to secure for him. He read history and economics at Cambridge and took first-class honors, going on to Harvard thereafter for some graduate work. He became a human rights activist and rose to be the Secretary General of Amnesty International. And quite appropriately, I think, he attracted the attention, or his qualities did, attracted the attention of the United Nations, which he, a system which he served as a troubleshooter for many more years in all parts of the world, Asia, Europe, and Africa and Latin America. Europe also? Yes, Bosnia, Herzegovina. But today he'll speak to us especially of his experiences in South Asia and Southeast Asia. And as someone who's been the representative of his own country, Bangladesh, myself in the UN for many years, I can tell you without fear of any contradiction that Ian is one of those few sort of global personalities who is held in very high esteem by all and sundry at the UN, all the three UNs that we speak of. He complements the role of the armed peacekeeper by sort of carrying the flag of UN as a man of peace to distant shores, complementing the role of the peacekeepers that we know of, which conjures up the image of the blue-helmeted soldier in APCs patrolling conflict areas. But there is another kind of work that the UN does to buttress stability in those spots. These are quiet civilian endeavors to project the soft power of the United Nations through often guile and guidance, advice and arbitration, and even dare and diplomacy. It is the combination of these abstract advances in norm setting and concrete gains in the areas of poverty alleviation, human rights, preservation, etc., also material welfare and progress, that enables the UN to work to make our world a little more habitable and hospitable. I will leave Ian to speak to the subject on hand at this point in time. And so, Ian, you have the microphone for the next 20 minutes or so, and then we'll have a Q&A for another, for the safety period of time.
Thank you very much indeed. It's a pleasure for me to be on this campus for the first time and to be a guest of the Institute of South Asian Studies. It's a pleasure to speak under your chairmanship, Dr. Chowdhury, both because of my association with your country that you've referred to, but also because of your extremely close knowledge of the United Nations system. And it's a pleasure to be here under the sponsorship, if I say so, of Professor S.D. Mooney, who became a friend and colleague through my involvement in Nepal, which is much shorter and less intense than his own, but you have on your campus the non-Nepali who knows most about the politics of Nepal and its political actors, although that is only one of the areas of specialty that he brings to you. Thank you for a very helpful introduction in assisting me in making the distinction that I want to begin with. For many people, peace operations, United Nations peace operations, is regarded as virtually synonymous with peacekeeping operations, and peacekeeping operations are defined by the uniformed military and often now police personnel who are a part of them, the blue helmets, as you say, Mr. Chairman. That UN peacekeeping has a very long history, including in Asia. The first classic deployment of military observers along a ceasefire line at the end of an interstate war was in Kashmir in January 1949, and 63 years later they're still there. The UN Military Observer Group in India and Pakistan. And then later on, the United Nations was pitchforked into the business of the deployment of larger military components authorized in certain circumstances to use force, beginning with the response to the Suez Crisis in 1956. Today, most United Nations peacekeeping operations have been and are in Africa, but the leading troop contributing countries indeed come from Asia, and specifically from South Asia. India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Nepal are almost consistently among the top 6 contributing countries to United Nations peacekeeping operations. But that doesn't mean that Asia is in a hurry to see blue helmets deployed in its own region. There have been large peacekeeping operations in Southeast Asia, not in South Asia. UNTAC in Cambodia in 1992-3 saw the deployment of some 16,000 United Nations troops. At that time, the largest military deployment the UN had overseen. And in East Timor, which I'm going to speak about, after the ballot in 1999 until just the end of last year, there were peacekeeping missions, including a military and police element. But there is a second category of peace operations. In the UN these days, they're called special political missions. They're managed differently by the Department of Political Affairs rather than by the Department of Peacekeeping Operations, with different budgetary arrangements, although those are not of particular interest to us this afternoon. They have just as long a history as peacekeeping operations. Some of the earliest UN presences were deployed in the context of decolonization. When I became involved in Libya on behalf of the United Nations, I discovered, and I think this was a discovery for many of my colleagues in New York as well, who, if they'd ever known it, had forgotten it, that the United Nations had played the crucial role in overseeing the independence of Libya, passing out of Italian colonialism and British and French military administration at the end of the Second World War, between 1949 and 51. And there are streets today in Tripoli and Benghazi named after the United Nations Commissioner of that day. Less happily in Southeast Asia, the UN had a presence in West Irian or West Papua during what was supposed to be a free act of self-determination, but indeed saw the UN complicit in what was not a real act of self-determination. My own personal experience includes having served in or alongside a number of major peacekeeping operations with large military components. But it happens that the 3 United Nations missions that I have headed as Special Representative of the Secretary General were indeed all in this category of political missions. Two of them in Asia, which I'm going to speak about, East Timor and Nepal, and more recently, but perhaps of some interest to you, even if it takes me out of Asia, in Libya. In all three cases, there were reasons, there were circumstances why a deployment of blue helmets, a military deployment, would not have been acceptable. And yet what I want to suggest to you is that a small, relatively small political mission was in each of these cases able to play a key role in some quite historical transitions. So let me speak briefly about them in chronological order. The question of East Timor had been on the United Nations agenda since Indonesia occupied East Timor in 1975. Although for many years it was effectively dormant as no real negotiations took place between Indonesia and Portugal, still regarded in the United Nations as the administering power as part of its colonial legacy. But then when political change in Indonesia led President Habibie to agree to the Timorese having the option to choose between autonomy within Indonesia or independence, the United Nations swiftly brokered agreements of 5th of May 1999 between Indonesia, Portugal and the UN, under which the United Nations would not merely monitor or observe, but actually carry out a one-person, one-vote referendum in East Timor, known as the Popular Consultation. Many people said at that time, certainly the Timorese leadership said, that ideally there should have been an international peacekeeping presence replacing the Indonesian security forces in East Timor for the peaceful carrying out of that referendum, the kind of UN military deployment that had been during elections in Namibia and, as I referred to, in Cambodia. Already, by the time the agreements were reached, there had been an escalation of violence by pro-Indonesian militia formed by the Indonesian army in the territory, and it was clear that security conditions would be very difficult. But it was, I believe, politically inconceivable in the internal politics of Indonesia that President Habibie or General Wiranto, his Minister of Defense and Chief of the Army, could have agreed to an international security deployment. And yet the Timorese, and particularly their leader, Shenana Gusmao, then under house arrest in Indonesia, believed it crucial that the window of opportunity that Habibie had opened should be taken. So the United Nations proceeded to deploy the mission that I headed, UNAMET, into East Timor in 1999, with the Indonesians remaining responsible for security during the popular consultation. The United Nations got agreement in principle that it would be Indonesian police, not the military, that would be responsible for election security, and that they would be advised by a small deployment of United Nations police officers. In theory, the United Nations got a commitment that the militia would be disarmed, that the army presence would be reduced and then confined to barracks, while the Timorese liberation movement, Falantil, would be confined to cantonments, and the Secretary General would ascertain that security conditions were satisfactory before the ballot took place. Well, UNAMET, the United Nations mission, faced and carried out a formidable task in the actual organization of the electoral process, registering electors throughout the districts of East Timor, very much lacking in infrastructure, in order to first register the electors and then prepare for the ballot. That work was carried out largely by United Nations volunteers, most of them the staff of electoral commissions from Asian and other countries. And frankly, I'm not sure we would have been allowed to do that under the security regime that exists today, because we deployed international personnel into the rural areas of East Timor beyond the limits of communication and security support that would today be acceptable. But the real dilemma that we faced was not so much our own security as the security of the Timorese, and particularly the pro-independence side, who continue to be subjected to violence and intimidation by the militia. That posed us with a real dilemma as to whether it was right to go forward to the vote. Clearly the conditions that the Secretary General was supposed to confirm existed did not exist. We twice briefly postponed the ballot from the 8th of August to the 30th of August. Each time we moved forward, we did so with the agreement of Shanana Kusmao and the Timorese leadership, who recognized the risk that was being run, but as I indicated, did not want to lose the window of opportunity. On election day, an astonishing 98.6% of those registered turned out to vote. Something like 50% of them having been queuing at the polling centres for hours before they opened at 6 o'clock in the morning, then in many cases going back to the hills because of their correct apprehension that violence would take place. And when those ballots were counted, 78.5% of the Timorese had voted for independence. And then many of you will recall the violence that followed, slightly preceded, but mainly followed the announcement of the vote, in which destruction of property and infrastructure across East Timor was widespread. A lot of the population were, if they didn't take refuge in the hills themselves, were evacuated to West Timor, in many cases forcibly. And our mission, the United Nations mission, ended up under siege in our own compound in Dili, joined by a number of internally displaced Timorese. In that context, eventually, actually very quickly, in something like 12 days, the President Habibie was persuaded to agree to request international assistance in restoring security in East Timor, and a multinational force led by Australia, Interfet, was rapidly deployed into the territory in due course to be replaced by a Blue Helmet United Nations force and a United Nations transitional administration to see East Timor through to full independence. But that takes me beyond the relevance of East Timor to my theme this afternoon, because at that stage the United Nations operation ceases to be a political mission alone and became a peacekeeping mission with a substantial military component. But I believe that what was done by that political mission, UNAMET, was undoubtedly a very considerable operational achievement, holding a ballot on the 30th of August on the basis of an agreement that had only been reached on the 5th of May. But it was also right to take the window of opportunity, even at the cost that the Timorese leadership opted to risk of further deaths and destruction. But the way many Timorese looked at that was that added only a limited number of additional deaths to the tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of Timorese who had died since 1975. Nepal, on the other hand, unlike East Timor, was never on the United Nations agenda until the peace process that I'm going to speak about. The United Nations story in relation to Nepal's transition begins really in 2002, when the civil war between a Maoist insurgency and the state was causing increasing international concern in its consequences for those who were trapped between the two sides. And Kofi Annan publicly, in his report to the General Assembly, offered his good offices to try to assist in Nepali efforts to bring the civil war to an end. And that began a low-key United Nations political involvement to engage with the parties, which in Nepal at that point really meant three parties. It meant the government, which was very much under the control of the king, King Gyanendra, the political parties whose parliamentary mandate had expired and who had been sidelined increasingly by the king, and of course by the Maoist rebels. Then on the 1st of February 2005, King Gyanendra carried out what was sometimes called the King's Coup, in which he took absolute authority and made himself chairman of the Council of Ministers, and unleashed the army in an attempt to bring a final end to the civil war. It didn't have that effect. The military stalemate continued with major reverses for both sides, but it further energized the international community, because now, to the serious human rights abuses on both sides of the armed conflict, was added violations of democratic rights, as the state of emergency saw the arrest of Nepal's parliamentary politicians, civil society leaders, attempts to control the media, and so on. And that led the United Nations Commission on Human Rights, meeting in Geneva, the predecessor to today's Human Rights Council, to put strong pressure on Nepal, either to face strong condemnation or to agree, as the government decided to do, to the establishment of an office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights in Nepal. And I went to Nepal, asked by Louise Arbour, the then High Commissioner for Human Rights, to establish that Human Rights Office. And we were able to be effective in mitigating the abuses of the armed conflict and helping open up again democratic space. But while the king insisted on retaining his own authority and not bringing the political parties back into government, the political parties reached an agreement with the Maoists, reached between them negotiating in Delhi, an understanding under which the political parties accepted the Maoist agenda of the election of a Constituent Assembly to reconsider Nepal's constitutional arrangements, and which for the Maoists meant opening the door to their objective of a republic. But to the Maoists it meant to enter a system of multi-party democracy, rule of law and respect for human rights. And that agreement, although the government, the king's government, was not party to it, became the platform for a people's movement, the Jana Andolan as it's known in Nepal, that culminated in 19 successive days of demonstrations in Kathmandu and throughout the country, facing the king with the choice of, or facing the security forces with the choice of gunning down peaceful demonstrators throughout the country, or the king stepping back, as ultimately, under international pressure and huge national pressure, he did. And at that point, the parliamentaries returned to government, the Maoists came to town, and a full comprehensive peace agreement was negotiated between them. Now, by then, the United Nations had established significant credibility with the Nepali actors through the political engagement, through the human rights role, through the opportunity that gave us for engagement with the Maoist leadership at different levels, for engagement with politicians, very often as a result of visiting them in arbitrary detention when they had been arrested by by the King's government. And India too came to see that at least some limited United Nations role might be necessary and useful in the implementation of the peace process. Because the parties had agreed that during the holding of the Constituent Assembly election, it was important to neutralise the armed forces on both sides. And that both the Maoist army, but also what was very much regarded as the King's army, should be restricted during the holding of the election. Placed under international supervision was the wording of the agreement, and it became clear that only the United Nations could realistically be asked to undertake that task. That's a task that the United Nations would normally undertake with blue helmets, with armed peacekeepers. But nobody wanted that. Neither side in Nepal wanted the deployment of armed blue helmets. India and indeed China, two big neighbours, neither wanted to see the deployment of a UN peacekeeping force into Nepal. So we were asked to do that with civilians who were ex-military, or indeed in some cases serving military, but who would operate unarmed in civilian dress, and a mere 184 arms monitors became responsible for ensuring that the commitments of the armies were maintained in 27 cantonment sites where the Maoist troops were gathered together, with the army itself also restricted to barracks, but in particular with the Maoist weapons stored under 24-hour United Nations surveillance, because the parties, backed very strongly by India, the United States and others, insisted that the Maoists must at least be separated from their weapons before they entered the interim government and proceeded to the Constituent Assembly election. Well, not without many hiccups along the way, the Constituency Assembly election was held in April of 2007. And that was the other United Nations role, was to try to help create the satisfactory conditions for that election by deploying personnel around the country where the Maoists had driven the leadership of the old political parties out of the areas they controlled, whereas the cities had been the monopoly of the state. The Constituent Assembly election, as many of you will recall, sent shockwaves through the capitals of most countries that were following Nepal, and certainly in New Delhi, when the Maoists, having been predicted by at least by intelligence and diplomatic sources to come a poor third, actually emerged as the largest single party, and with overwhelming claim to form the next government under the prime ministership of their chairman Prachanda. But at that point, consensus amongst the political parties broke down. The Maoists did not agree to their main partner in the peace process, Girija Prasad Koirala of the Nepali Congress, becoming president. And that began a period that has continued up to this time, in which the political parties have never formed an all-party government as they had intended to do until the drafting of a constitution. And worse, the Constituent Assembly that was elected with such difficulty, but with the achievement of an extremely diverse and representative body, went out of existence in May last year, despite extensions of its time period, without having drafted a constitution. And Nepal today is facing another election under a government headed by the Chief Justice to try to continue that task to a constitution. But along the way, Nepal has declared the peace process concluded, in the sense that the last of the Maoist combatants either left the cantonments with grants to assist them in resettlement, or a relatively small number, some 1,400, to be integrated into the Nepal army. Well, before this, the United Nations mission had come to an end, and Nepal had decided that it would see that process to an end itself. But it was a United Nations mission, I would contend, which was indispensable to seeing Nepal through an extraordinarily tense period of transition. I want to end by taking you briefly out of Asia. It was because of my role in designing and managing the mission in Nepal that I was asked to become advisor to the Secretary General. The title was to coordinate post-conflict planning for Libya. When the Libyan revolution had begun in February of 2011, the Secretary General had appointed a mediator, a former Foreign Minister of Jordan, to try to bring the conflict to a peaceful mediated end, which of course was not the outcome, but wisely, I think, decided at the same time to look ahead to the role that the United Nations would be expected to play when the conflict did come to an end. Many people thought that might require a peacekeeping mission, but the Libyans, although those in favour of the revolution will welcome the support they had from NATO and Gulf states that intervened to support them mainly from the air. Libyans were extremely resistant to the suggestion that there would be boots on the ground, as it were, that there would be any foreign military presence on the ground in Libya after the conflict. And so there too, the role we were asked to plan was that of a special political mission focused in particular on support to the democratic transition. The Libyans had set themselves an ambitious roadmap for when they would hold elections, and yet those elections would be the first of any kind in Libya for nearly 50 years, would take place in the absence of any electoral legislation, any electoral management body, any political parties, free media, free civil society, and yet were to take place within a set period of time after they declared their liberation. And it was a very considerable achievement for the Libyans, and an achievement, I think, for the United Nations in supporting them, that election was held in surprisingly fair and satisfactory circumstances in July last year. That said, an election was a necessary condition for progress in Libya. It wasn't a sufficient condition, and Libya is the government formed on the basis of that General National Congress election is today wrestling with Libya's most major problem, which is how to move from a large number of locally based militia that fought the conflict to an eventual state monopoly of force through a proper army and police, where the inheritance from the Gaddafi period is one of almost no institutional capacity. So if I were to conclude, I would tell you what I'm sure you know very well, that there are no simple success stories, certainly in United Nations operations. The United Nations only goes to places because the problems on the ground are complex and acute. The mission I headed in Libya until October last year is still trying to assist the Libyans in struggling with the issues I've referred to. I went back to Timor-Leste, as it then was, in May 2006 as a special envoy because the security sector in Timor-Leste had imploded, and its small military and police force were fighting amongst themselves and each others on partly regional lines, necessitating an increase again of international support, although the 2012 story of successful presidential and parliamentary elections in Timor-Leste is a more happy one. And in Nepal, as I've indicated, while the military side of the peace process may be complete, the future constitutional arrangements and how Nepal's diversity is reflected in a new constitution is yet to be achieved. But I would like you to believe that the United Nations is able to play a key role in transitions, not necessarily because of the deployment of large peacekeeping operations with many thousands of military. In East Timor, we had 1,000 personnel at the peak, and that included Timorese electoral officials hired only for 5 days for carrying out the ballot. In Nepal, our peak numbers are about the same, around 1,000. And the UN mission in Libya today has an authorized strength of less than 300 international and national personnel. So I believe that these are a side of the United Nations work that is not always sufficiently reflected in discussions and literature that focuses on large peacekeeping operations, and I'm grateful for an opportunity to talk to you about it today.
Thank you. Thank you, Ian, for that very comprehensive description and analysis of that flip side of the UN coin, that though Chapter 7 involved, but quiet work done in order to build upon peace or create situations where there is no sort of slide back to states of anarchy. I'd request, the floor is open for Q&A now. I'd request you to identify, though I might know you, but request you to identify yourself for the sake of electronic record. Mr. Surya Narayana?
Yeah, Surya Narayana from ISAS. So, I mean, everyone knows that the UN military observer mission in reference to India and Pakistan has been dysfunctional and irrelevant. As an experienced UN official, what do you think that it's time to wind it up, and if not, why not?
I'm happily quite ignorant of the experience of UNMOGIP, but indeed, as you say, since 1971, there has been effectively no Indian cooperation with UNMOGIP, and a desire to see the presence ended, and of course it's Pakistan, however, that has wanted to see the deployment continue on its side of the line of control. I think what you say would be shared by many people at the UN. There's considerable impatience at deployments. Cyprus is another case which have a history of 50 years or more. But once the United Nations has deployed at the request of two parties, then ideally it requires the two parties to come to an agreement as to the ending of its role, and that two-party agreement hasn't been possible in the case of Kashmir, as you know better than I do.
Thank you. Mr. Javed Berki.
Just for the next one presentation, UN is invited in governments that are interested in a particular situation. The question is, how much room for maneuver do professionals such as yourself have within that framework? Can hundreds of people who go to a particular operation do something on their own within the constraints that are imposed? And do you learn something as you go from one mission to another?
It's a very good question. I mean, of course, formally one is bound by the mandate for the particular mission, which is negotiated with the host country and then adopted by the Security Council in most cases. But it's also the case that a special representative of the Secretary General is regarded as an extension of the Secretary General in terms of what the UN calls the good office's role of the Secretary General. And therefore has a degree of license to offer advice, engagement in areas not necessarily confined by the mandate. Of course, that still has to be, in practice, acceptable to the parties. But to that extent, the role is not exclusively defined by the mandate. I mean, for example, in Libya, we had a very clear mandate in relation to supporting the election, but the major threat to the election had to do with local conflicts that the UN had no formal third-party role to mediate, and yet our presence was able quietly to help defuse those, at least to the extent that they didn't imperil the election going forward. The other thing I think is important to say about the United Nations is that it is a normative institution. It carries with it the Charter, it carries with it the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it carries with it certain commitments agreed by the United Nations system. So that, for example, when one comes to the representation of women, someone acting in the name of the Secretary General has a very clear mandate, whether it's part of the Council resolution, or actually the Council these days usually will include in the resolution, to promote the representation of women. So in both Nepal and Libya, and indeed East Timor, although not during the referendum, which didn't raise that question, the UN has certainly advocated electoral arrangements that guarantee a degree of representation of women that would not necessarily come about without special measures. And of course, the more general questions of respect for human rights are also United Nations norms that it takes with it into any situation.
Well, Noreen Fink.
Noreen Fink, I'm with the Center on Global Counterterrorism Cooperation in New York. I actually had two questions, if I might. One was, to what extent is the Holder versus Humanitarian Law ruling about designate material support for terrorist groups, whether it is at all affecting mediation in the field? A number of people have mentioned that it's posing challenges.
The what, sorry?
It's the Holder versus Humanitarian Law ruling.
Right.
And to what extent that's affecting mediation prospects in the field. And my second question, as you talked about the evolution of SPMs, is that with the mandates becoming sort of increasingly complex and looking at a host of security threats, including organized crime or terrorism, like in the Libya mandate and in the Mali mandate, to what extent do you think the UN the system is sort of willing and able to respond to these complex pressures with some of the limitations you've talked about in terms of resources for SPMs?
Right. First, I mean, the UN does not regard itself as bound by any national ruling in relation to who it should or shouldn't talk to. And in general, the UN will always take the view that it's necessary to talk to those who are political actors, whatever their methods in any conflict that it's addressing. There are cases where the UN has to some extent ruled itself out of that, the most obvious one being Israel and Palestine, where the UN's membership in the Quartet has led to the UN to some extent, although not completely, accepting the Quartet's restrictions on dealing with Hamas, and many people in the UN would regard that as unfortunate. The former UN Special Coordinator Alvaro de Soto, in an end of assignment report that was leaked and quite widely publicised, was very critical of the constraints on an effective UN mediation role that limitations on contacts with Hamas imposed. But essentially, so far as the UN is concerned, these are matters for the Secretary General to instruct his special representatives or mediators. There could be problems resulting from US legislation, obviously, given the fact that the US is the UN's host country, but I'm not aware that those have occurred yet. The second part of your question is certainly a very good one too, because I think the truth is that the UN is only beginning to face the kinds of issues that you refer to. I mean, in Libya, in principle, we were given quite an extensive mandate to try to assist the Libyans, and everything is to assist the Libyans in addressing the flow of arms and ammunition out of Libya. But of course that goes very much to border security and to the extremely limited Libyan capacity even to absorb assistance. Mali, you're absolutely right to refer to, and again, it's much too early days in terms of the deployment of a new mission into Mali to know what its strategy and capacity is really going to be to address the terrorist issues of the north of Mali. So it would be silly to suggest that the UN is strongly placed in terms of its capacity at this time. It clearly isn't, because it's facing new challenges and is going to have to develop the experience and capacity to address them.
Yes, Professor Mooney.
Two small questions. One is, why is there, did you feel there is a resistance in Asia to UN involvement in internal conflicts particularly? If it is so, why is it so? Has the UN ever thought about it in terms of Security Council or those who are managing it? The second question is, you said you got involved in Nepal on the human rights to begin with. Now, did you make any assessment from which side greater violations of the human rights came? The Maoists or the Nepal army?
It is indeed a very interesting question as to why the insistence on national sovereignty and the resistance to third-party intervention of most kinds is as strong in Asia than it is. Some of the answers to that are, as indeed I think you were the one who made this point in earlier discussions, are country specific. In the case of India, the Kashmir issue I think is relevant to India's attitude to UN involvement in its broader neighbourhood, but the attitude is general. In the case of East Timor, there was no realistic alternative to the UN playing the role it did. It had been an issue on the UN agenda in '75 and before that in the context of decolonisation, but when the question of assisting the implementation of a peace agreement in Aceh came along, it clearly would not have been acceptable to Indonesia for the UN to have played that role, and they turned to the European Union to play the implementing role on the ground. So I don't fully know the answer myself. We have an Asian Secretary General, the second Asian Secretary General. There has been no lack of Asian-led mediation efforts from the United Nations. But nonetheless, the resistance to third-party intervention is strong.
Is there a follow-up?
No, yeah, may I just insert a caveat here? Is it because of the composition of Security Council, which is, you find the Asian representation being very, very weak, only one country, and China, you mentioned in relation to Nepal, but even in other cases. Is that the reason? If tomorrow, hypothetically, you restructure Security Council with a greater Asian representation?
Perhaps, but then you have to then ask why that argument doesn't apply to Africa or indeed the Americas. I mean, the UN played the central role in the Central American peace processes. Africa is very weakly represented on the Council. It doesn't have a permanent member at all, and I mean, perhaps, however, the degree of evident need in Africa is more the answer. I mean, clearly, there ought to be better representation of Asia and of other regions on the Security Council, and everybody agrees that the composition of the Security Council is anachronistic, but nobody can agree on what is the right formula take its place, and that leaves some of the anachronisms rather happy that despite their theoretical acceptance of the case for change in the composition of the council, it's going to be very difficult for agreement to be reached. But if the Security Council included, let us say for the sake of present argument, India and Japan as well as China, would that mean that that countries in Asia would be more open to United Nations political engagement? I'm not sure that it would. Your second question related to the burden of human rights violations on the two sides of the armed conflict in Nepal. I mean, there's no doubt that statistically the largest number of violations were perpetrated by state security forces, by the police in the early stages of the armed conflict when they were deployed against the Maoists, and then by the army once it intervened. So, you know, some categories of violations, the number of people who disappeared, for example, are quite well documented in terms of responsibility in whose custody they were before they disappeared. The Maoists certainly committed a number of atrocities at different stages, but the state security forces' efforts to track down and eliminate Maoists and Maoist sympathisers, I think undoubtedly involved a larger number of victims than the Maoists' own abuses.
Did you make an assessment officially in the Human Rights Office?
Well, during my time, things were moving too fast, really, for that kind of analysis, but the Office of the High Commissioner did carry out a major mapping of violations throughout the conflict, which is now in the public domain. And that certainly can be turned to for the kind of analysis that I just referred to of disappearances. It's based not entirely on information researched by the United Nations itself. It's also based on NGO sources in Nepal, so it can't all be regarded as verified information, but I don't think there's any doubt about the overall accuracy of the picture. The reason the United Nations did that, I mean, in part it was to bring to a culmination the human rights monitoring work of the UN, but it was also because under the peace agreement Nepal committed itself to establish a truth commission, and this was to enable a truth commission once established to already have before it this compendium of information from the United Nations and gathered by the United Nations. Now, as you know, the Nepali parties go on reiterating their commitment that a truth commission will be established, but there's been long controversy about the nature of the legislation, and as of now, legislation has not been passed, and therefore there's been no beginning on the work of an official Truth Commission.
Well, thank you very much. It's my sad task now to bring this interesting discussion to an end. Thank you, Ian. As you know that in ISAS we are focused on intra and inter South Asian relations, but there's a burgeoning interest in our region in the United Nations, in the multilateral bodies as we globalize. Each country of South Asia globalizes more and more. As you have said, that South Asia has had a tremendous interest and participation in the areas that you spoke of. Of course, the United Nations is a multifaceted system, but in peacekeeping, even peacemaking to a certain extent, peacekeeping, peace building, and the special operations missions that you have spoken about. Also in what Professor Muni spoke of eventually in the restructuring of the United Nations. So there is a political, there is an economic, there is a strategic interest in the United Nations. we hope that these relations will grow stronger. On electoral support that many of member states receive from the United Nations, we're grateful to the system, of course, and in my own country, the UN has been involved in Bangladesh, and hopefully we'll have interactions with regard to the forthcoming elections in January next year. So Ian, thank you very much for enhancing our understanding of how the UN operates in these issues, which sometimes are not very often discussed in literature. So we've got a sort of got it from the horse's mouth, so to say, insights. And thank you for those. And on behalf of, could I request all of you to join me in thanking Ian, and further thank him by giving him a token in appreciation of his time with us, a token which is a production of our intellect, so to say, two of our researchers, D'Souza and Jetli. Jetli work on perspectives of South Asian security. Could I invite you all, ladies and gentlemen, to tea with the speaker, a tea reception with the speaker immediately afterwards, which will give you a little further opportunity to interact with you.
Thank you. Thank you.